A black farmer walks into an airport showroom to buy a jet. However, instead of receiving a warm welcome, he is met with racism and insults from the sales staff. Will these cruel prejudices prevent him from realizing his dream? This story serves as a powerful reminder of human worth and the ongoing fight against injustice. Where are you watching this video from? Share your thoughts in the comments below and be sure to hit subscribe so you don't miss more stories like this. Thomas, a black man with the sun-kissed skin of a farmer, stepped out of his old, worn-out pickup truck in front of the airplane showroom at the Central Airport. His muddy boots, faded cap, and tattered checkered shirt made him stand out sharply against the luxurious and modern surroundings, but he didn't care. Today was the day he had decided to make his lifelong dream come true, owning a private jet. He walked slowly inside, where gleaming aircraft were displayed like pieces of art. His footsteps echoed on the polished marble floor, attracting the attention of everyone in the room. But the attention wasn't out of curiosity or respect. It was filled with cold judgment and disdain. Salespeople in sharp suits looked him up and down, and a young man, likely the manager, frowned and shook his head in disbelief, as if he couldn't understand why someone like Thomas would even enter. Customers dressed in high-end fashion didn't try to hide their annoyance. A woman standing near the reception desk whispered to another person, "What's he doing here? He looks like he just walked off a farm." A soft chuckle followed her comment. Thomas could feel every glance and whisper, but instead of walking away, he kept his head held high and his gaze steady. He knew he didn't fit the typical image of a jet buyer. No custom-tailored suit, no expensive watch, and no luxury car. But that didn't matter. He had a dream, and today he had the means to make it come true. Thomas stopped in front of a small but elegant jet. Its polished metal exterior gleamed under the overhead lights. He reached out and gently touched the jet's body, appreciating the perfection of its craftsmanship. For him, this was more than just a mode of transport. It was a symbol of the hard work and success he had earned. What he didn't know was that this moment would mark the beginning of many challenges ahead. In a corner of the room, a group of customers exchanged glances, their whispers growing louder. "What does he think he's doing?" muttered a middle-aged man, loud enough for Thomas to hear. "Probably imagining he's a pilot." Thomas froze for a moment, his fists tightening, but he didn't react. Instead, he stayed calm, reminding himself that he had every right to be there, just like anyone else. Little did Thomas know, this was only the start of a long and challenging day. He stood still, his eyes tracing every detail of the jet, his heart filled with the hope of fulfilling a long-held dream. Meanwhile, Greg, a young salesman with slick-back hair, a perfectly pressed suit, and a sense of superiority fitting for this glamorous world, was focused on Thomas. He didn't bother to hide the disdain on his face as he watched him. Greg began to walk toward Thomas slowly, each step purposeful and filled with an air of dominance. His lips curled into a smirk, and his cold eyes seemed to say that Thomas didn't belong in this space. When Greg got close enough, he crossed his arms and tilted his head slightly, speaking to Thomas with a tone full of mockery. "Excuse me, are you sure you're in the right place?" Greg's voice was a mix of sarcasm and contempt. His gaze swept over Thomas, taking in the faded hat on his head, the simple shirt he wore, and the muddy boots on his feet. "This is an airplane showroom, not a gas station," he added. His words weren't just sharp, they were meant to insult. Greg didn't need to say much more to make his contempt clear, but Thomas didn't react. Instead, he remained silent, turning his head slowly to meet Greg's gaze. His lips pressed into a thin line, and his hand rested gently on the plane, as if drawing strength from it. His silence wasn't a sign of weakness, but a deliberate choice to stay composed. Greg wasn't done yet. He took another step closer, invading Thomas's personal space, clearly trying to escalate the situation. "I think you might find something more suitable for yourself over at the used car parts store," Greg continued, his voice cutting through the air like a sharp blade. "This place is for people who know what they're doing and actually have the means. Do you get what I'm saying?" Greg's words weren't just insults, they carried a deeper message. He didn't believe someone like Thomas, with his rugged appearance and unrefined look, could belong in such a fancy environment. Greg was used to dealing with clients who arrived in sharp suits, wore luxury watches, and stepped out of expensive cars. He had no respect for anyone who didn't fit that mold, showing no patience for people who weren't like him. The other people in the showroom began to notice the exchange. A few customers threw quick, curious glances in their direction, their eyes filled with a mixture of interest and amusement, almost as if they were waiting to see how Thomas would react. Nearby, a woman leaned toward her companion and whispered, "He must not know where he is. Looks like he just stepped off a muddy field." Thomas heard the whispers, but he chose to stay silent. He understood that any quick reaction from him would only strengthen the stereotypes these people already held about him. Instead, he took a deep breath, keeping his gaze calm and focusing only on the one thing that truly mattered, making his dream come true. Seeing that Thomas didn't immediately react, Greg assumed he was in control. His smirk grew wider, dripping with condescension. "Do you even want to know the price of this plane?" Greg drawled, dragging out the words to highlight the perceived gap between them. "This isn't something someone like you can easily afford. I'd suggest you save your time and hours." Greg's words were a sharp attack on Thomas's pride, but instead of backing down, Thomas stood taller. His eyes gleamed with quiet determination. He didn't need to prove himself to Greg, or to anyone else in the room for that matter. Yet what Thomas didn't know was that an even greater challenge was coming his way. As he tried to maintain his focus, despite Greg's harsh attitude hanging in the air, he ran his hand across the sleek control panel of the airplane in front of him, feeling the smoothness of its design and the advanced technology it represented. But soon, the fragile silence was broken by murmurs from other corners of the showroom. "He's probably just here to take pictures," muttered a woman near the reception desk, her voice dripping with sarcasm. She was dressed in an expensive dress, arms crossed over her chest, as though she already knew the punchline to the scene unfolding before her. "Pictures? I bet he thinks this is some kind of giveaway," replied an older man seated further back, laughing derisively. His laughter drew a few amused smirks from others nearby, adding to the oppressive atmosphere in the showroom. Thomas could feel every gaze on him, not out of curiosity, but out of judgment and scorn. Some people deliberately looked away when he glanced their way, but their mocking expressions were hard to miss. The whispers grew louder, no longer masked in subtlety. A young man near the reception counter sneered, "Look at the way he's dressed. Bet he thinks he belongs here. What a joke." The insults didn't stop there. Another customer, a middle-aged man with silver hair and thick glasses, shook his head and smirked. "Maybe he's here to apply for a cleaning job. Probably wants to polish the planes," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. A few people laughed openly at this, but it wasn't just playful teasing anymore. Some of the comments were clearly racially charged. A woman standing near a smaller aircraft shrugged and said to her companion, "I don't think this is a place for someone like him. Maybe he should stick to working in the fields." Her words sliced through the air like a sharp blade, deeply cutting into Thomas' sense of dignity. The prejudice he was facing went beyond just his looks or clothes. It seemed to target his very identity as a hardworking black man who had earned everything he had. While Thomas was usually unfazed by such remarks, these comments made him feel isolated, surrounded by people who didn't understand his journey. He took a deep breath, trying to suppress his emotions. Instead of reacting or leaving the room as they might have expected, he walked slowly toward another employee, intending to ask for more information about the airplane. But before he could speak, Greg, the staff member who had mocked him earlier, reappeared with a malicious smirk. "Back again. What do you want this time?" Greg said, his tone as condescending as before. "I thought we made it clear this isn't the place for you. These planes aren't just for looking at." Thomas stared at Greg without flinching, his eyes calm but full of resolve. "I'm not here just to look," he replied, his voice low but firm, stressing each word. But before he could continue, another voice interrupted from across the room. "Yeah, let him dream," a male voice said loudly, dripping with mockery. "That's probably all he's good for." Thomas' chest tightened, and his hands clenched, but not out of rage. He was holding on to his composure, knowing that losing his temper would only confirm their belief that he didn't belong there. Yet with every cruel remark, it felt like a wave crashing against him, testing his patience. But even so, a spark of determination began to burn brighter within him. It wasn't anger that Thomas felt, but a deep, unshakable resolve. He knew he couldn't let the hurtful words define him or push him away from his goal. But the real question was, how could he face this situation while keeping his dignity intact? That was the challenge he had to confront with every step he took. Thomas stood still, trying to maintain his composure as the jeers around him grew louder. It felt as though every gaze in the room was drilling into him, waiting for him to crumble or leave. Then, unexpectedly, he felt a gentle tap on his shoulder from behind. The touch startled him just enough to turn around, and there, standing before him, was a familiar face. "Thomas, I didn't expect to see you here." A warm, friendly voice broke through the tense atmosphere. It was James, an old friend from high school. Like Thomas, James was also black, but his career had taken him to a very different place in life. His neatly trimmed hair, expensive gray suit, and polished leather shoes stood in stark contrast to Thomas' simpler look. Thomas stared at James for a moment, then exclaimed, "James, is that really you?" A rare smile appeared on his face, one that hadn't been seen all day. James smiled back and pulled Thomas into a friendly hug. His presence seemed to ease the tense atmosphere slightly, although the scrutinizing eyes in the room hadn't turned away from them. "What are you doing here?" James asked, his tone a mixture of curiosity and encouragement. "Don't tell me you're here to buy a plane." He chuckled lightly, his eyes sparkling with respect, not skepticism, something Thomas hadn't seen from anyone else in the showroom. Thomas hesitated for a moment, a flicker of embarrassment creeping into his heart. He felt the stark difference between himself and James, not just in appearance, but in how confidently James carried himself in such a high-end environment, as if it was made for him. Finally, Thomas answered honestly, "Actually, yes, I'm here to buy a plane, but it seems like no one here believes I can." James scanned the room, his eyes sharpening as he took in the people nearby. "The people here," he said firmly, "you don't need to worry about them. They don't understand you, and honestly, they don't matter." His voice was resolute, but there was an undertone of encouragement in it. Thomas nodded slightly, though a trace of unease still lingered in his eyes. "Did you hear what they were saying?" he asked, his voice lowering slightly. "The insults, those looks, they make me feel like I don't belong here." James placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder and looked him squarely in the eye. "Thomas, remember who you are," he said, his voice steady. "You've worked hard your whole life to get here. Their words don't define your worth, and they definitely can't stop you from reaching your dream." He paused, a smile returning to his face. "And I'm here to make sure you don't give up." James's words were like a spark, reigniting Thomas's confidence. He felt the warmth of friendship, something he hadn't felt during the long, stressful day. The two friends began to chat for a while, and Thomas felt some of the tension in his chest ease. However, it seemed that James's presence also attracted more attention from the people around them. From across the room, curious glances began to fall on the pair. Greg stood, arms crossed, his cold eyes fixed on James and Thomas. A faint, disdainful smirk appeared on his face. He wasn't just irritated that Thomas was still there. James' arrival, with his clear success and confidence, only fueled Greg's annoyance. "Looks like his friend's trying to act important too," Greg muttered to a colleague nearby, loud enough for others to hear. As Greg spoke, some of the attendees began murmuring again, no longer focusing solely on Thomas, but now turning their judgment toward James as well. Thomas noticed this shift and leaned in closer to James, speaking softly. "You know, sometimes I wonder if it's even worth it. Those looks make me feel like I'm on a battlefield I can't win." James shook his head firmly. "It's worth it, Thomas. No one can decide your dreams except you. If you give up, that's when they win. But if you stand your ground and keep going, you'll prove them wrong." Thomas gave a faint smile, feeling a spark of strength return, but he knew the challenge wasn't over. Not with Greg's piercing gaze and the venomous whispers still swirling around them. Even so, James's presence had rekindled his confidence. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but now he no longer felt completely alone. Standing next to James, Thomas clenched his fists, his eyes fixed on the airplane before him. Though his heart was strengthened by determination, The oppressive atmosphere in the showroom felt like a storm about to break. He decided it was time to leave. But just as he was about to turn away, a voice shattered the fragile silence. "Do you think you can buy an airplane dressed like that?" The voice boomed, loud enough to make nearby customers turn their heads. A middle-aged man in an expensive gray suit and polished leather shoes raised his voice intentionally, trying to draw attention. He smirked, his eyes locked on Thomas with open disdain. Thomas stopped, his shoulders tensing, but he didn't immediately turn around. Realizing he had an audience, the man continued in an even more mocking tone. "Seriously, just look at yourself. You should probably head back to your farm. That's where you belong." The man's words drew a few chuckles from those nearby, soft, but loud enough to echo throughout the showroom. A woman standing near the reception desk covered her mouth with her hand, though her eyes sparkled with satisfaction. The mocking remarks seemed to fuel a wave of judgmental stares from all corners of the room, as if the crowd were relishing the drama. James frowned and stepped forward as if to intervene, but Thomas raised a hand to stop him. He knew his friend wanted to stand up for him, but this was a moment he had to face on his own. Slowly, Thomas turned his head, meeting the older man's gaze directly. "If you have something to say to me, just say it," Thomas replied, his voice calm yet sharp. His words weren't loud, but they cut through the room, silencing the laughter for a moment. The man seemed taken aback by the retort, but quickly regained his composure. "Straightforward, huh?" He sneered. "All right, I'll be blunt. You look completely out of place here. This is a place for people who can actually afford their dreams, not for wishful thinking." A few people nearby nodded in agreement, as if the man had voiced what they were all thinking. Greg, standing a few steps away, crossed his arms and smirked coldly. He didn't say a word, but his silence seemed to encourage the man's venomous remarks. Unable to hold back any longer, James stepped forward and confronted the man. "I don't recall any rule that says you can't buy an airplane based on how you dress or what you do for a living," he said coldly. "Or do you think you have the right to decide who belongs here?" The man chuckled dismissively, though his eyes flickered with irritation. "I'm just saying what everyone else is thinking," he replied with a shrug. "But if you're his friend, it's no wonder. Do you even know where you are? This isn't a place for taking chances." James began to speak again, but Thomas stepped forward. He knew this was his moment to speak, not for them, but for himself. "I know exactly where I am," Thomas said, his voice steady but low. "I'm here to buy an airplane, and I don't need anyone's approval to do it." The words hung in the air, freezing the atmosphere in the showroom. The older man hesitated for a moment, though his arrogance kept him rooted in place. "Oh, really? Then show us what you've got. But remember, not everyone is cut out for big things," he sneered. Thomas didn't respond immediately. He held the man's gaze, unwavering. Finally, he turned to James. "Let's go," he said, his tone calm but firm. Deep inside, a fire of pride and unyielding determination burned within him. The showroom fell into a heavy silence as Thomas and James walked out. But it wasn't a silence of respect. It was one of anticipation, as if everyone was waiting for Thomas to fail. Thomas knew this was just the beginning of a battle he couldn't afford to lose. Just as Thomas and James stepped away from the airplane, a mocking laugh echoed from behind them, sharp, clear, and full of challenge. The sound pierced through Thomas's patience like a dart. The middle-aged man, the source of the taunt, raised an eyebrow and smirked. His voice carried across the showroom with obvious disdain. "Oh, you're leaving already? I thought someone as ambitious as you might try to prove something. But I guess I overestimated my expectations." Thomas froze, his hands clenched tightly by his sides. This time, he couldn't ignore it. He turned around slowly, his steps deliberate and firm, heading back toward the man. The room fell silent, and every eye turned toward him. "What do you want me to prove?" Thomas's voice was deep and steady, yet it carried an undeniable authority. His eyes gleamed with newfound confidence, free from hesitation or doubt. "I didn't come here to please anyone in this room. I came to get what I know I deserve." His words rang out like a bell, shattering the oppressive atmosphere of contempt. The older man's eyes flickered with surprise for a brief moment before his sneer returned. "Nice speech," he shrugged dismissively. "But we all know talk doesn't buy anything. A faint smile crossed Thomas's lips, though it wasn't one of amusement. It was the smile of someone who had been underestimated too many times, but had always found a way to rise above. Slowly, Thomas reached into the breast pocket of his shirt and pulled out a check. He held the check high for everyone to see. The number on it caused gasps to ripple through the crowd. It matched the exact value of the airplane he had been inspecting. The room fell into stunned silence. The mocking laughter and disdainful glances disappeared as if they had never existed. The middle-aged man swallowed hard, his gaze shifting between the check and Thomas's unwavering expression, struggling to process what he was seeing. Greg, the salesman, stood frozen, gripping the edge of the display counter. The smug confidence that had been on Greg's face dissolved into confusion and unease. Thomas took another step forward and extended the check toward the middle-aged man. "You're right. Words don't buy anything, but money does," he said, his tone calm but sharp as a razor. "And I have what it takes to turn my dreams into reality. So do you have anything else to say?" The man's mouth opened, but no words came out. Thomas lowered the check, his gaze sweeping across the room. The once derisive stares now avoided his. "What any of you think doesn't matter," Thomas continued, his voice gaining strength. "What matters is that I know who I am, and I know what I deserve. If anyone in this room believes I don't belong here, they should take a hard look at themselves." His words struck a nerve, leaving an unmistakable mark on the room. Behind him, James smiled with quiet pride. Greg, visibly flustered, stepped forward, trying to salvage the situation. "Sir, perhaps there's been a misunderstanding," Greg stammered, his tone now lacking the earlier sarcasm, replaced by nervousness. "If you're genuinely interested in purchasing the aircraft, we'd be happy to assist you." Thomas turned to Greg, his gaze as sharp as a blade. "A misunderstanding? No, there's been no misunderstanding. I think you're fully aware of the attitude you've displayed toward me since the moment I walked in." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Let me make this clear. I don't need your assistance. I'll buy the plane from a place that understands how to respect its customers." Thomas's final words ended the argument. He turned and walked away, his steps slow but filled with dignity. Behind him, the room was left in an awkward silence, the discomfort palpable. Yet within him, a fire of determination burned brighter than ever. He wasn't just standing up for himself. He was making it clear that no one had the right to judge another's worth based solely on appearances. Thomas left the gallery, but his heart couldn't find peace. The stares, the insults, and the disdain felt like knives carving deep into his mind. Standing by his old pickup truck, he gripped his phone tightly. Pausing for a moment, he took a deep breath and dialed Marcus. His son arrived not long after, dressed in a charcoal gray suit, impeccably tailored, with polished black leather shoes that gleamed. His perfectly knotted tie stood out with flawless precision. His piercing eyes scanned the gallery, quickly locating his father, who stood quietly near the entrance. "Dad," Marcus called out, his voice deep and commanding. Thomas turned and saw his son striding toward him with broad shoulders and steady steps, exuding an air of justice. Marcus placed a hand on his father's shoulder, his eyes filled with both empathy and determination. "Are you all right?" Thomas nodded faintly, but his silence spoke volumes. Marcus's gaze darkened as he glanced toward the gallery, where a few people were still murmuring, though now more subdued. Greg, the sales associate, avoided Marcus's gaze, though his unease was evident. Marcus entered the gallery like a storm. Curious looks quickly turned into nervous glances. He stopped at the reception desk, where Greg was trying to maintain a composed facade. "Are you the one in charge here?" Marcus asked, his voice calm but filled with authority. Greg flinched, forcing a thin, nervous smile. "Ah, I'm just a sales associate," he stammered. "If you're looking for more information, that's enough." Marcus cut him off, his gaze icy. "You thought you had the right to treat my father that way. Your words and the words of those here weren't just insulting, they were blatantly discriminatory. I expect an apology. Now." The tension in the room was palpable. Greg began to sweat, his eyes darting toward the other customers as if seeking support, but no one dared to intervene. The middle-aged man who had mocked Thomas earlier stepped back, his arrogance drained from his face. Listen, Greg stuttered, trying to steady his voice. We didn't mean any harm. Maybe it was just a misunderstanding. Misunderstanding. Marcus's tone sharpened. A misunderstanding that you looked down on my father just because he was dressed differently. A misunderstanding that you think you have the right to decide who belongs here. Marcus said, his voice firm. Greg froze, unable to respond. The customers who had joined in the mockery earlier now avoided Marcus's piercing gaze. The room fell silent, broken only by Marcus' resolute voice. If there's no apology right now, I won't let this go, he declared. I'm a lawyer. My father wasn't just insulted, he was subjected to blatant discrimination in a public business. I will take legal action against you and this company if necessary. A few whispers rippled through the room, but no one dared to speak out against him. Greg swallowed hard, his face going pale. Finally, he awkwardly bowed his head toward Thomas. Sir, I apologize if my words offended you. Thomas met Greg's eyes. His expression was no longer angry, but steady and firm. This apology isn't for me, he said. It's a lesson for all of you on how to treat everyone with respect, no matter how they look or where they come from. Marcus stood quietly beside his father, his gaze still stern. He turned to the group of customers who had mocked Thomas earlier. What about you? Did you think you had the right to laugh at my father just because he's not like you? There was no response. The middle-aged man, who had been the loudest earlier, mumbled something incoherent before quickly lowering his head. A few others hurried to find excuses to leave the gallery, unwilling to face Marcus any longer. Marcus turned back to his father and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Dad, let's go. They've seen enough. Yet within Marcus, a fire of resolve continued to burn. He knew this wasn't just about one instance of disrespect. It was a bigger issue, and he was determined to fight so that no one would ever dare to look down on his father again. When Thomas and Marcus left the airport, it seemed the matter had ended. But for Marcus, this was more than a personal issue. It was an insult to his father's dignity, honor, and human rights, and he was determined to bring it to light. A few weeks later, a lawsuit was filed in the local court. The company that owned the aircraft showroom was accused of discriminatory practices and humiliating a customer, specifically Thomas. Marcus led the legal team, building a solid case with evidence, witnesses, and strong arguments. At the first hearing, the courtroom was packed with representatives from the company, attorneys, and involved employees, including Greg, who had directly mocked Thomas. Greg's face was tense as he sat quietly with the company's legal team, avoiding Marcus's piercing gaze. Marcus began his opening statement with a calm but powerful tone. Your Honor, he said, his eyes scanning the room, we are here today to expose a painful truth. Discrimination not only exists but is tolerated in modern business environments. My father, Thomas, was subjected to an unacceptable act, one that no one in this society should have to endure. The company's attorney immediately rose to object. Your Honor, we believe this case has been exaggerated. The remarks Mr. Thomas overheard were misunderstandings, not meant to offend or discriminate. Marcus remained undeterred. Misunderstandings, he repeated, emphasizing each syllable. His sharp eyes locked onto the opposing team. We have clear evidence that this was not a misunderstanding, but a deliberate attempt to humiliate and demean my father. And I will prove that now. Marcus signaled for a young woman to take the witness stand, Patricia, an employee at the showroom who had secretly recorded the incident because she couldn't stand her colleague's mistreatment of Thomas. Patricia, can you recount what you witnessed that day? Marcus asked, his voice low but commanding. Patricia took a deep breath, briefly glancing at Greg, who now looked as though he wanted to shrink into his seat. I saw everything, she said firmly. Greg and some customers made discriminatory remarks toward Mr. Thomas. They mocked him for his appearance and profession. I couldn't stay silent, so I secretly recorded the conversation. Marcus nodded, a confident smile crossing his face. Do you have that recording? He asked. Patricia nodded and handed her phone to Marcus. He connected it to the courtroom's audio system. As the recording played, the room fell into a heavy silence. The mocking voices of Greg and the customers rang out clearly. You think you can afford a plain dress like that? Go back to your farm. He probably thinks this is a charity giveaway. Each statement cut through the room like a knife, leaving the air thick with tension. Greg stared at the table, his face pale, while the company's attorneys tried to maintain composure, though it was clear they had little left to argue. When the recording ended, Marcus stepped forward and addressed the judge directly. Your Honor, this is not a misunderstanding. This is discrimination, an intentional assault on my father's dignity. And it's not just my father who's a victim. Anyone who doesn't fit their idea of an ideal customer could easily become a target. The company's lawyers stood to counter. We don't deny that those remarks were inappropriate, but the company can't be held responsible for individual actions that were neither authorized nor reflective of management policy. Marcus turned sharply, his gaze like a laser cutting through the defense. The company cannot evade responsibility, he said, his tone calm but sharp. This isn't just about individual behavior. This is about the culture the company fosters, an environment that tolerates and fails to address such conduct. If the company doesn't take responsibility, then who will? The judge, seated at the high bench, nodded slowly. The evidence is very clear, he said gravely. We will proceed with this case to determine the extent of the company's and the individual's responsibilities. But I must say, what I've heard so far is deeply troubling. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Marcus turned to look at his father, his eyes filled with determination. Thomas gave a subtle nod, a silent sign of pride in his son. However, Marcus knew the battle was far from over. This was only the beginning of their journey toward justice. When the recording played in the courtroom, all eyes turned to the speaker. The sarcastic remarks in mockery rang clearly, unmistakably. Do you think you can buy a plane in that suit? Go back to your farm. It suits you better. Another comment followed. He probably thinks this place gives out freebies. The words cut through the courtroom like knives, filling the air with thick tension. These weren't just insults. They carried a deep prejudice against Thomas, not only because of his appearance but also due to his background. Thomas stayed calm, but his hands clenched tightly in his lap, trying to suppress the pain. Patricia, seated at the witness stand, took a deep breath before speaking. These words aren't just offensive. They reflect the attitude Mr. Thomas faced the moment he entered that showroom. I worked there and saw it all. What you just heard is the truth, and it happens every day to people they consider unworthy of being there. The company's lawyers shifted nervously as the evidence was laid bare. One of the lawyers, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair, stood to offer a defense. Your Honor, we do not deny that these remarks were inappropriate. However, we argue that this was an isolated incident and does not represent the company's values or policies. Marcus stood immediately, his expression cold and firm. It does represent the company, he stressed, his voice unwavering. This is an environment where such behavior is allowed. Greg, the salesperson, didn't just make these remarks. He was supported by approving looks from colleagues and customers. This isn't a one-time issue. It's a systemic problem. The defense team struggled to maintain composure. One of them suggested, we will implement additional employee training and tighter oversight moving forward. But Marcus wasn't convinced. Training alone won't be enough, he stated firmly. My father isn't the first person to face this treatment, and unless real action is taken, he won't be the last. The company must take responsibility, not just for the words spoken, but for the silence that lets such behavior continue. The judge, an older woman with a stern look, spoke after hearing the recording and both sides' arguments. The evidence clearly shows that Mr. Thomas was subjected to discrimination. This cannot be dismissed as an individual's actions. The company has a duty to create a fair environment where this type of behavior is not tolerated. She turned to the defense team. I suggest you reconsider your position. Would you like to discuss a reasonable settlement, or would you prefer to continue arguing? The company's lawyers huddled together, clearly uneasy. But Marcus wasn't finished. Your Honor, he said, his voice steady and firm, my father didn't come here for a token apology or empty promises. He came here to regain the respect and dignity that was stolen from him. We won't stop until justice is done. The courtroom fell silent, and Greg remained motionless, his face pale. The lawyers exchanged hurried whispers, and one stood to speak. We are willing to discuss settlement terms, he said, voice low and reluctant. The judge nodded. Good. We will continue settlement talks next session, but let me remind you, if a satisfactory resolution isn't reached, this case will go to trial. With that, the courtroom session ended. As Marcus turned to his father, a faint smile appeared on his face. "We're on the right track, Dad," he whispered, his eyes shining with pride. The final day of the trial arrived, and the courtroom was packed with reporters, witnesses, and curious onlookers. Thomas and Marcus stood by, maintaining their composure despite knowing this was the most critical moment. The judge entered, her expression stern, and she began reading the verdict after a few moments of silence. "After thoroughly reviewing all the evidence and hearing both sides, I have concluded that Mr. Thomas has suffered severe discrimination in a public business setting," she said. The recorded statements presented in court were not only deeply offensive but also reveal a culture of disrespect and tolerance for misconduct within the defendant company. The judge paused, her gaze shifting to the defense team. "This behavior violates basic principles of fair business practices and goes against human rights and anti-discrimination laws." The defense team lowered their heads, avoiding eye contact, and Gray, the main figure of the controversy, sat quietly, his face drained of color. The judge continued, her voice firm. "Therefore, I rule that the defendant company is directly responsible for the acts of discrimination and harassment toward Mr. Thomas. The company is ordered to pay a fine of $500,000 to compensate Mr. Thomas and fund programs promoting equality and combating racism." A murmur spread throughout the courtroom at the hefty fine, which would undoubtedly impact the company's reputation. But the judge wasn't done. "Additionally," she continued, "the company is required to implement mandatory anti-discrimination and equality training for all employees. These programs will be monitored by an independent body to ensure their effectiveness." Marcus nodded slightly, a faint smile on his lips. This was exactly what he had hoped for, not just financial compensation, but a cultural change within the company. The judge turned her gaze to the company representatives. "I also ordered that the company issue a public apology to Mr. Thomas, both in writing and through media platforms. This apology is not just an acknowledgement of wrongdoing, but the first step toward restoring trust in the community." The courtroom was silent except for the sound of the judge's gavel as she declared, "This court is adjourned." Thomas turned to Marcus, his eyes full of gratitude. "You did it," he said softly, his voice filled with emotion. Marcus placed a hand on his father's shoulder, his own eyes gleaming with determination. "This is justice, Dad," he replied. Greg, embarrassed and defeated, quietly left the courtroom, and the defense team packed up without a word. Outside, Thomas and Marcus stepped into the bright daylight, ready to move on to the next phase of their journey. Later, as they walked into the showroom where it all started, the atmosphere shifted. The employees who once mocked Thomas fell silent. Greg, the leader of the mockery, was now behind the counter, trying to shrink in shame. Thomas approached, his steps confident and deliberate. He stood before Greg and the others, his eyes calm yet radiating assurance. "Do you remember me?" Thomas asked, his voice steady, filling the room. The only response was a series of hesitant nods. "The last time I left here," Thomas continued, his tone firm, "you laughed, judged, and mocked me based on my appearance. But today, I'm not here to buy a plane from you. I'm here to remind you that prejudice and attitudes like yours are wrong and will never take away anyone's worth." Greg opened his mouth to speak, but Thomas raised a hand, silencing him. "I don't need an apology. The court has already spoken. What I want you to remember is that every customer who walks through that door deserves respect, no matter their appearance, clothing, or background." Turning away, Thomas led Marcus to a rival company's display area, where a staff member greeted them with genuine respect. After inspecting the planes, Thomas signed a contract for the plane he had once been mocked for aspiring to own. This was not just about acquiring a dream, but about doing so on his own terms, without bowing to anyone. When they left the rival showroom, Thomas and Marcus were triumphant. The once arrogant employees who mocked Thomas now stood in quiet regret. As they boarded the plane, Thomas felt a deep sense of pride and fulfillment. It wasn't just the plane that symbolized victory, but the journey that had led him here, one of resilience, dignity, and overcoming prejudice. When they landed, Thomas was welcomed by his family, their joy radiating. As they gathered around the dinner table that evening, Thomas shared his experience, emphasizing that no one had the right to define anyone's worth except themselves. Marcus nodded, adding, "Justice doesn't come naturally. We have to fight for it, stand up against it, and never stay silent in the face of injustice." Meanwhile, Greg was no longer employed at the showroom. The company had been forced to change its policies, implementing stricter training and oversight. The customers who had joined in mocking Thomas reflected on their actions, carrying with them a newfound understanding of respect. Thomas's journey was not just about buying a plane. It was about proving that determination, self-respect, and courage could overcome any obstacle. As he soared through the blue skies, his plane was not just a vehicle, but a symbol of the power of justice and believing in oneself. His story was a powerful lesson in resilience and standing up for what is right.